Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. To all our guests, our business leaders, colleagues, and partners, welcome to this event today. It is my privilege to welcome you, our in-person audience, as well as our online audience, to today's event on behalf of the Anti-Corruption Coalition, ACC, and our partners in this work, the Institute for Security Studies, ISS. As we gather under this theme of future-proofing South African business against crime. The aim of tonight is to launch a policy brief on this topic, which you should have a copy if you are in the room, and there is a link for those online to the publication. My name is Nyeleti Magadzi, and I'm the head of stakeholder engagement for the ACC, which is an initiative of the Center for Business Ethics at GIBS. This conversation could not have come at a more timely. Across our country, businesses, large and small, are confronting the growing impact of crime in its many forms: organized crime, cyber threats, theft, corruption, and fraud. These challenges threaten not only profitability and investment, but also jobs, community safety, and confidence in our economic future. We're also witnessing what's happening and what seems to be deep-seated corruption in our law enforcement agency through the Matlanga Commission and the Parliamentary Ad Hoc Committee. This should not only be worrying, it should get us into action. It should take us out of a mode of wanting to react to what we find out, to being more proactive and actually acting with a lot more agency and, more importantly, collaboratively. This event brings together leaders from the private sector, government, law enforcement, and civil society to explore how we can collaborate more effectively, sharing our intelligence, strengths in our systems, and designing proactive strategies that safeguard business while contributing to our national stability. Our collective task is to move from a posture of being reactive, but to be more deliberate, ensuring that integrity, security, trust, and ethics become defining features of doing business in South Africa. The ACC, through GIBS, is well positioned to convene key role players to discuss what collective action is and what action should be taken. We are at a time where our country has to focus on building trust, strengthening governance, and ensuring that business can operate within a secure and predictable environment. Future-proofing our enterprises against crime is therefore not simply a matter of protection, it is a matter of sustainability, resilience, and competitiveness. On behalf of the ACC and ISS, I thank you for your presence and commitment to this work. Your leadership in your different areas and the engagement is a vital way to start building a business, civil society, government, communities that not only prosper, but also are safe, transparent, and future ready. On that note, I would like to call upon Colette Ashton, who was part of developing this brief, to come and present some of the findings from the policy brief. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Colette. I'm an anti-corruption lawyer and researcher at the ISS. This journey for me started about 6 years ago at a workshop at the UN-founded International Anti-Corruption Academy in Vienna. It was a decisive moment in my life. Anti-corruption professionals, professors, and experts from all over the world gathered to analyze anti-corruption reform projects that had worked and to try to find a leverage point for a new project in a new country where it was likely to work. After a day of intense discussion, the group chose the most viable leverage point for anti-corruption reform in the world to be the private sector here in South Africa. Since then, the ISS has been working on reform projects in this area, and I want to talk today about our latest research with GIBS. We think that there are at least two quite serious gaps. One, there's very little academic research in this area, in corruption in business in South Africa. Two, we seem to be behind the trend of growing a thriving anti-corruption compliance industry for the private sector. I'm going to talk about our research process and some of the research findings. Then we're going to show a short video, and then my co-author, Erin, will complete the picture. Starting at the beginning. As a researcher, when you start, you define your research questions. And we had many. What types of corruption are there in different sectors in South Africa? What are the drivers of that corruption? What is the day-to-day experience of business leaders and their employees in the workforce with regard to corruption? How many companies use anti-corruption compliance programs? What types of companies use them? And how many of these are effective, good faith anti-corruption compliance programs? In other words, not paper compliance or tick box exercises. Do they really work? And we started, as researchers tend to do, with a literature review, and what we found was surprising to us. There's a research gap. Having studied international anti-corruption literature, I expected from a country like South Africa with a relatively sophisticated private sector, doing business in a context of systemic corruption, I expected to find a body of academic literature about this, and it simply wasn't there. It's also surprising in the context of the findings of the Zondo Commission about the role of the private sector in state capture, and a wealth of investigative journalism on the topic. It's difficult to say why there is this research gap. In many other countries, comparable to us, like developing countries like Brazil, Malaysia, Nigeria, European countries, they've got a lot more academic research in this area than we do. This research tells their policymakers about the types and drivers of corruption that they can expect to find in different industries. It tells them which anti-corruption compliance programs work and which don't. It tells them how to make things better. A research gap in this area for us is a serious problem because anti-corruption law and policy can't be built on nothing. All policy reform needs a solid evidence base. This is especially true with corruption, which is not a simple problem. It's systemic, it's complex. Solutions that seem obvious often don't work and sometimes even backfire. For now, we have a working hypothesis that many of the bigger South African companies, which are exposed to global markets and also exposed to extraterritorial anti-corruption jurisdiction by the United States, which used to be the world's biggest anti-bribery enforcer. We're not sure what will happen in this space in future. We believe many of these bigger companies probably have got substantial anti-corruption compliance programs in place and probably expect their supply chains to do the same. But we don't know enough. We don't know if these programs are working and why. We don't know if they are based, if they're legalistic and punitive, or values-based and leadership-driven. We don't know what is happening, and so we can't improve things. Academics, please get your pens out. You can really help the anti-corruption struggle in this country. There also seems to us to be a gap in the working world. In many other comparable countries, anti-corruption compliance is a thriving, growing industry. It's a well-known career path. There are university courses teaching the multidisciplinary design of anti-corruption compliance for the private sector, using economics, behavioral psychology, data analytics, forensic accounting, and a little bit of law, but not too much. I've met some anti-corruption professionals from other countries. One is on our panel tonight. And I can say confidently that contrary to what some of us might think, anti-corruption fighters are not just in government or in civil society. They're also in the private sector in the form of, for example, a chief compliance officer who might need to take on the CEO in order to safeguard integrity in the firm. Where are our private sector anti-corruption fighters? Do we have enough? Where are the specialist university courses in anti-corruption compliance? We are behind the world in this field, and we cannot afford to remain there. To sum up, there are two serious gaps: a research gap and a gap in the workforce. For our research method in this early exploration into anti-corruption methods in South Africa in the private sector, we deliberately selected a research method that doesn't look for corruption. We are not trying to name and shame. That's not our job. In any case, the research shows that it's not always that helpful. We are here to look for solutions. And to do this, one needs to adopt a different lens, not looking for what is wrong, but looking for the good and building on that. The method is called virtuous circles, where anti-corruption researchers look for examples of projects or systems that are working, however imperfectly, and then try to nurture these, to find ways to help them grow, to counteract the many circles, the many vicious circles of systemic corruption in the business environment. So we used a positive lens to look for positive projects, to grow them in positive ways. It's a forward-looking approach, seeking innovations in the field of prevention, because as much as we believe anti-corruption enforcement is important, the focus of this research is on the equally important theme of corruption prevention. In the policy brief, we write about 2 virtuous circles in anti-corruption in the private sector that have already started in South Africa, but probably need strengthening. Firstly, we talk about anti-corruption compliance programs in companies. We explain that there are such things as effective good faith anti-corruption compliance programs that really work, and believe it or not, that have been proven to correlate with improved financial performance at the company. Yes, it may sound counterintuitive, but international research shows that integrity really is good for business. Secondly, the policy brief talks about a method called anti-corruption collective action, where companies in a sector collaborate to reduce corruption in their own financial interests. Next, we're going to show you a short video about an anti-corruption reform project, an anti-corruption collective action project in Nigeria, which is so successful that it's come to be known as the Nigerian Miracle. It's run by a remarkable man called Soji Apampa, who you will meet in the video, a businessman who describes himself as simply an angry engineer.
The Nigerian miracle. The first miracle was that Nigerian public officials agreed to work with the private sector, and they also agreed to work with civil society in collective action. That was the first miracle, because it has been very difficult to get that level of cooperation on an issue, and then especially on an issue that is considered to be as sensitive as the issue of corruption in Nigeria. The private sector found itself in a corner. The UK Bribery Act had come into force. This is now 2011, 2012. And the proprietors of a lot of the shipping companies thought, we're in trouble if we don't do something because of the new offense in that UK Bribery Act, which says failure to prevent bribery is an offense under the Act. Under the UK Bribery Act, and even under UNCAC, the UN Convention Against Corruption, and even the OECD or the FCPA, many of these facilitation payments and other things have now become outlawed. So therefore, there was high risk for the private sector if they didn't do something. So with a lot of contrition, they approached the Nigerian government to say, we know that we've been part of the problem right from the beginning, but we'd like to be part of the solution. Can we work together towards these ends? In the early days, it took as many as 150 signatures for a vessel to come into Nigeria's waters, do its business, and leave again. And of course, with that number of touch points, you could not avoid corruption. So the first thing to do was to identify standard operating procedures and remove the overlaps between the operations of different agencies. The second miracle was that the government was prepared to get 14 agencies in the room and encourage them to work together to reduce corruption. The third miracle was that they actually did work together. They identified a lot of the areas of risk and their own standard operating procedures. It was a great start, a great place to start. So the private sector was then able to ask, what then happens if these operating procedures are not followed? And this is when a grievance reporting mechanism was agreed. But where we now hit a snag was when we then asked that, well, can we have access to this data of the reports that we've been making so that we can track what has been done with what case and so on? And that's when we hit a brick wall that, well, it's now secret. Anything you give to government now becomes secret, and the file is marked secret. So when we couldn't get any data and we couldn't follow up on any cases during implementation, then we had to build what we called a help desk. And we thought about it, that the process of coming into Nigeria's waters and leaving is finite. When you arrive, when you birth, you do your business, and then you depart. It's easy to break those into processes. So we did. And we were able to convince the shipmasters that, well, if they were too scared to report issues to the government, they could report to the help desk. But here's a help desk number, And from the time they come into Nigeria's waters, they're already testing the number, testing the WhatsApp number as well to see whether there would be a person to respond to them when they came into port. And that way, we were able to, in real time, go with the masters through their paces. And as soon as they hit a snag, we knew they would tell us through the help desk. The help desk will escalate to its partner, primary partner in government, which is the Nigeria Shippers Council. The Shippers Council will escalate to immigrations if it's an immigrations issue, or to customs, whoever it was, and they would stay with the issue until it was resolved. Then we got to a stage where the masters were able to also share the gangway log with the help desk. So we knew which officials of what agencies were on board at what time. And so when there was an issue, we found that with the Shippers Council, the intervention could even be immediate, where there would be a phone call to the vessel and questioning to the official to see about some questionable demands that were being made and so on. And that way, a lot of things got quelled before they became bigger issues.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Colette, for the presentation and for the video. My name is Erin. I'm a senior researcher at the Anti-Corruption Coalition at GIBS, and very happy co-author with Colette from ISS. Just want to speak a little bit about what brought me here as well to this research as well, working with Colette. So earlier in the year, during another ISS panel, actually, I heard corruption described as a happy crime. And I thought that stuck with me because it is, in the sense, a sort of a happy crime. So unlike other violent crimes, it often lacks a direct visible victim that the corruptor can see or is confronted by. And those involved often derive huge benefits from it. So nobody's going to really want to report what they're doing because they're receiving a great benefit. I can't help but think about the pairs of green Lamborghinis that have recently been taken by asset forfeiture thanks to the Tembisa accused. It's also harder to detect and prosecute because everyone involved benefits and has little incentive to report it. Or, as recently evident, they become afraid to. In 2020, the GIBS Ethics Barometer, performed by the Center of Business Ethics here, surveyed 50,000 employees working for over 35 of SA's biggest companies. One of the most striking findings about the survey, relevant to corruption, one of the biggest challenges facing companies is that many employees say that they do not report misconduct simply because of fear of victimization or because of the expectation that nothing is going to be done about it. This is reinforced by what we witness now. In recent years, those who are willing to come forward or to investigate corruption or wrongdoing are being silenced. I can't help but think of Thomas and Marie Klutter or Babita Diakoren in these cases. So this brought us to another part of the research in this policy brief, and which Colette has touched on already, which is how do we convince business and those in business to do more about corruption? And perhaps really about asking a simple and very important question is that as business, do you truly benefit from corruption? On the surface, some may answer yes, maybe a shocking answer, but they get richer, right? A little bit of bribery here, a little bit of corruption there, doesn't it make the business richer? A company who pays a bribe to outmaneuver competitors or to win tenders sometimes could see the bribe as just the cost of doing business. We've heard that phrase so often. And in the short term, yes, it may seem beneficial because they're bringing in the big contracts. They're winning over their competitors. But does that benefit business collectively, or does it only benefit the Lamborghini owners? The recent research is actually telling a different story, though. Transparency International has reviewed 30 years of evidence and found that while bribery and corruption may provide short-term advantage for organizations, the long-term costs far outweigh the benefits. Corruption undermines markets, it slows growth, it increases costs, and it erodes productivity. Even when undetected by regulators, it damages staff morale. If you think about the culture that it creates within the organization, a culture of fear, a culture of not wanting to speak up. It weakens overall performance, and when the corruption is exposed, the consequences can be severe for an organization. Legal penalties, loss of investor confidence, reputational damage, or simply talent leaving the company. And we only have to look at local examples here, right here in South Africa. What happened to KPMG, Bain and McKinsey, who all faced very serious reputational damage for their involvement with the Guptas and state capture. Or even a company like Steinhoff, which we saw collapse after the multi-billion euro accounting fraud, orchestrated by the then CEO and other executives. It caused the share price to plummet and resulted in massive losses for investors. But I think prior to the exposure of the fraud, I'm pretty sure that Jooste and all the others involved were very happy to benefit from the billions of rands and dollars and euros that they were buying art, jewelry, wine farms, horse farms, whatever it may have been. Ultimately, though, it destroyed the entire company and those connected to it. In contrast to this, Transparency International's research has consistently shown that integrity pays in the long term. Companies that have invested in anti-corruption measures and strong corporate social responsibility perform better. 30 years worth of research has shown this, not just ethically, but financially. So these firms, they enjoy higher profitability, stronger reputations, and greater innovation over the long term because their people simply enjoy working there more. They're more resilient. And for SMMEs, although the challenge of implementing integrity systems may be greater, the rewards are much, much higher. They have better access to contracts, improved profitability, and sustainable growth, not the quick win from the bribe that you gave to the government official that you're friends with. So integrity, in short, it's not just about ethics, it's just good business. And it's not enough to practice integrity just internally. It has to be communicated effectively. As Colette mentioned earlier, some businesses may have extensive compliance programs internally, but these need to be communicated effectively to the public as well. Research has shown that anti-corruption initiatives communicated through the right channels can make a real difference. There's still a concern, though. The lack of motivation by business, particularly in South Africa, to drive anti-compliance initiatives remains a problem. In 2023, here at a GIBS event, Executive Chairman of Rothschilds & Co. and Vice President of Business Unity South Africa, Martin Kingston, said that it was unrealistic to expect business to self-regulate, as it's just simply not in their interest and not in their character. But what this means is that we need a competent state that is able to apply appropriate regulation and put appropriate regulation in place. What's the implication of this? Collective theory, which is what we've touched on in our policy brief, implies that in the context of systemic corruption, companies are less likely to choose integrity. The challenge is that post-state capture in South Africa, we are dealing with a weakened state where we continuously hear about lack of political will, In the last few months, that's a statement that I've heard so many times I've lost count. The lack of political will, which is supposed to effectively regulate business, but it isn't there. So what should we do now? What can we do to be proactive about preventing corruption? One of the biggest gaps in our fight is the lack of collective action projects, coordinated initiatives that bring business together with civil society and or the public sector and drive the systemic change that is needed to tackle corruption. There are some great examples of this, and hopefully we'll hear some this evening, such as with the SIU, but they're still too limited. The B20 Business Collective happening now itself is highlighting the importance of collective action in a weak regulatory environment, which is what we find ourselves in now. Recommendation 3.1 provides that business should strengthen support and incentives for organizations to engage and drive collective action for inclusive growth. Collective action can complement, enhance, and further develop current and future laws and regulations wherever the latter are weakly enforced. As Colette mentioned, we need the research and we need the collective action to be able to underpin the future laws and regulations that are required to get us out of this. So to address this, our policy brief proposes the creation of a business and civil society working group. This is a business-driven initiative. We're putting the ball in business's court, but it's aimed at pushing corruption out of key sectors through collaboration, accountability, and shared leadership. We're asking business not to just focus on themselves individually, but on their entire sector. The group leverages civil society's research capacity and convening power, whilst engaging the private sector as its committed partner and funder. Together, the working group works towards designing international best practices for anti-corruption collective action projects, tailored to the South African context, and something that we can use to develop policy in the future. The first step is to identify sectors most affected by corruption and most motivated to take action. For each sector, we could establish a dedicated secretariat led by a civil society organization and supported by private sector funding to coordinate projects that tackle major corruption challenges in those sectors. So beyond addressing the immediate risks, these initiatives will future-proof the sectors by developing clear compliance standards, strengthening ethical practices, and building long-term resilience. So at its heart, we're asking for a partnership between business and civil society to drive out corruption and ensure that integrity is no longer just a principle, but actually a competitive advantage for business in their particular sector. And hopefully, in so doing, we make anti-corruption compliance in the sector a little bit more attractive than paying the bribe for the quick win now. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin and Colette, for those insights into your paper. Welcome everybody to this panel. My name is Cheryl Frank. I work for the Institute for Security Studies and I run the Anti-Corruption and Accountability Project. Thank you for joining us. We're really privileged today to have an excellent group of panelists that are going to help us delve into these issues and the challenges you place before us. As civil society, but certainly as business leaders. So this conversation is going to focus on two things. One is leadership in business and how we ask our business community, challenge our business community to take us forward in terms of some of the recommendations you've made in this paper. Secondly, we want to focus on prevention. And we're going to talk a little bit more about prevention on this panel. So we won't spend too much time talking about our introductions, but really speak to our panelists who can give us more insights into these issues. We will have a Q&A session at the end of this panel. Those of you online, please feel free to drop your comments and your questions into the chat, and we will pick up on those as we move through the panel. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today, and we're very lucky to have Gulakane Mate, who's the CEO of Business Unity South Africa, and with an extensive and possibly expensive background in the business sector. Peter Solomson also joins us online. Thank you, Peter, for joining us. He served as General Counsel to Siemens in its efforts and very famous efforts to address prevention and address corruption and bring prevention into the business. Pranesh Miraj, thank you for joining us. Chief Program Portfolio Officer, I have to keep remembering that title, at the SIU. And Pranesh heads data analytics work at the SIU and is also spearheading the SIU's emerging and very ambitious efforts around prevention. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
And you, of course, have met Colette and Erin as our authors of our paper. So thank you all for being online with us and in person. We want to set the scene to start. So let's just speak a little bit about a broad framing of what we know about the private sector and its role in corruption and state capture. And both Erin and Pranesh have great insight into these issues. Erin particularly through her history of working as a researcher at the Zondo Commission. So Erin, please share your observations at a very high level of those, what you saw emerging at the Zondo Commission about corruption in the private sector.
Okay. Thanks, thanks, Cheryl. So I fortunately got a heads up on this question, so I'm just going to tell you already that I've got some notes. I think there's two things I want to maybe bring up is obviously my experience at the Zondo Commission did give me some insight into the very active role that business had in the state capture project. We think about the McKinseys and regiments and trillions of the project and their specific driving of many of the corrupt activities and tenders that were occurring at the big SOEs like Transnet and Eskom and so on. But also, I mean, here at GIBS, they wrote a report on Zondo for Business that was actually commissioned by BLSA, doing a bit of an analysis on the Zondo recommendations and talking about what was the role of business, or what is the role of business. And I think that report really highlighted something very important where they demonstrated the devastation of the systemic corruption, where self-enrichment really became the norm, and how that drove a culture of corruption and a breakdown of the integrity in the industry. So what stood out for me is in the analysis is how many layers of failure there actually were in the state and in business. It was the fragmentation of the institutions, it was the weakening of oversight, it was the dodgy procurement practices, the intimidation of whistleblowers, and a lot of that was driven by the collusion with the private sector. And I think that's something that needs to be, more attention needs to be given to. But I think another really important issue that came out of that is the bigger loss of trust and how the state capture years and the involvement in the state and business has really broken down trust in the industry. And that's something else that we need to really kind of claw back now. So yeah, I think just from a high level, those would be the observations. It's the collusion with business, but also then the breakdown of trust and all of that has to be repaired as we go forward.
Thanks for that. Pranesh, you have the great benefit of the SIU's data over several years of investigations. So if you could also reflect on this, the themes that you see emerging in terms of those in-depth investigations and particularly you're investigating the public sector, but seeing what the private sector engages in that perspective.
Thanks very much, Cheryl. I think for us, and based on our experiences as the SIU in investigations emanating from the Zondo Commission, what we've seen is that the Zondo Commission was actually a catalyst or a trigger for business to actually, let's say, some in the business sector to actually say, we're coming forward. We recognize that as business, we must do the right thing. There was an appreciation that integrity is very important, and in the long term, especially for business, we've got to conduct ourselves in an ethical manner. You must bear in mind the government is the biggest buyer of goods, works, and services. And as a business, why would you want to find yourself on the National Treasury database of restricted suppliers or on the register for tender defaulters? Why would you want to deprive yourself of that opportunity? So what we've seen in our investigations and the outcomes of those investigations is that there are certain companies that have actually now come forward. They voluntarily presented themselves and they've cooperated to the point where it's no longer an adversarial kind of a relationship. So rather than resolving matters through costly and lengthy litigation, we've managed to find a way, we've managed to meet each other halfway in terms of reparations and remediation. And that certainly is commendable. But having said that, it's certainly not enough. It's just the tip of the iceberg. We're just at the beginning. And, we are hoping that as time goes on, that we are going to see more and more businesses coming forward, especially in the investigations that we are doing.
I think it's a helpful segue to ask, our policy brief argues broadly that clean business practices, which some of that emerges through your engagements with business, clean business practices are good for business. And yet we know that corruption continues. And Kulakani, you're with us online, reflecting on your experiences. What goes on at the leadership levels of companies that allow corrupt practices to take place? I mean, what do you identify as the real pressure points that where businesses just continue knowing that there are the ethical problems, the range of issues that Erin explains, the erosion of trust, all these emerging problems? Why does it continue?
Thank you, and good evening to the fellow panelists and everybody attending tonight. Firstly, I should just say that, the question is difficult. It's difficult because there isn't a place, a club somewhere where corrupt people meet and discuss these things, right? Where corruption happens, it's always in some sort of secret. Yes, it might evolve into an organizational culture in certain organizations where there isn't adherence to ethical business practices, et cetera, et cetera. So it's hard to say that these are the actions or the pressures that lead to corruption. I don't think that there is enough known about that, partly because it is breaking the book. But what I do want to say is that I think there are many more businesses that just get on with their business and run their businesses ethically. And of course, you have those that some of which have been caught in the act, the Zondo Commission and other processes that have shown them to be engaging in corrupt practices. So there is no denying of that. But I think where organizations prioritize and actually talk about ethical business practices and where leaders are committed to ethical business practices, and there's a culture within that organization of doing the right thing, you're unlikely to find corruption taking place. And I think from the examples that are known, the more famous ones, you will see the behavior of people who engaged in corruption that, of course, they become brazen, they do outrageous things, they buy anything that can be bought to show that they have money, etc., etc. And there's one thing clear about that is that in that practice, there is no long-term commitment to anything. It's about the now. So again, you can tell from businesses that tend to set incentives, short-term incentives, that they are going to run into trouble at some point, whether through corruption or just exposing themselves in ways that lead to their businesses failing. So taking a long-term view on anything does moderate excessive behaviors of any kind. And I would argue that in the majority of cases, businesses go on about doing business in the right way. But where there is corruption is when businesses are preoccupied and focus on the short term. And yes, there are those who set up entities purely to to do corrupt things. Many of those who are now called businesses, these were never entities that were meant to do business, rather than to get a particular tender and make money because they either had a friend inside or they had identified somebody they can corrupt, etc., etc. I'm not necessarily saying those are the only ones, because we know about some big listed companies that were also caught in there. The point I'm merely making here is that I don't think there is a known sort of set of practices or set of pressures that are there, except to say setting very short-term incentives can lead to this. So let me give you an example. If my own pay is dependent on bringing X amount of business into the company, and that's all that the business cares about, it doesn't care about how do I make those sales. That opens up opportunities for employees, for executives, for even senior business leaders within those companies to start doing things and cutting corners and leading to what we started seeing happening. And I do think that the setting of incentives in business is probably one of the key culprits that lead to the corruption that we have seen unfold. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that. I suppose, I think we should, let's move to a discussion about prevention, because we keep talking about the fact that our regulatory environment isn't good enough, isn't strong enough as it stands. And we seem to have an over-reliance on our law enforcement agencies. Then we complain that our law enforcement agencies are not functioning. We're incredibly depressed about the lack of state capture prosecutions. Colette, let's speak a little bit to the question of prevention. And let's understand why we need to go there. Make that argument for us.
Well, I think all over the world, countries are looking to supplement anti-corruption enforcement. It's not only in South Africa that we struggle to get convictions for corruption. It's even in developed countries, even the mighty United States Department of Justice struggles to get convictions for corruption. And that's built into the design of our legal system. Our legal system is hundreds and hundreds of years old, and it was designed to prosecute crimes like murder, where there's a body and there are witnesses. And as Aaron mentioned earlier, corruption is known as the happy crime, where you have perpetrators hiding the crime in secrecy, in a pact of secrecy, in order to keep it from law enforcement officials. And to make matters worse, it's about complex financial transactions. The money's often left the country way ahead of warrants being issued. It's already in another jurisdiction. And we have the criminal burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is extremely difficult for prosecutors to meet when they come up against well-resourced opponents who can bring 30, 40 counsel into court. It's almost impossible. And so we are joining an international movement looking for prevention, because when we talk about corruption, Prevention really is better than cure. There are projects in other countries, like, for example, Uncle Soji's project in Nigeria, that has brought down levels of corruption in Lagos Harbour by 96%. If they can do it there, we can certainly cut and paste that project into our own context. Beyond examples like that, there are many studies by the OECD, by the UNODC that demonstrate that corruption prevention is cost-effective and works better than enforcement, and is a complementary approach that needs to be used at the same time.
So then that places the spotlight then back on business, because we're talking about prevention and what we can do inside our businesses, inside potentially our business networks, potentially supply chains. So Peter, I wanted to bring you into the conversation. You led a remarkable cleanup effort in Siemens. Tell us about the role played by leadership in effecting that process.
I'm happy to do that, but it's a little bit of a cliche, and I want to get to that after I said something else, which is how impressed I am by what you're doing. When I set up the Siemens Integrity Initiative, committing $100 million to this kind of work, it had a rather limp beginning. And I think what you're doing now, having observed and dealt with corruption in many markets, including the United States, collective action is exactly the right tool for business. I mean, to answer your question, it's all about leadership, and you've heard this a million times. It's a cliche. Good leaders know everything that Colette and Aaron have been talking about and act accordingly. Poor, ignorant, weak, fearful leaders do the opposite. But they're sometimes confronted with weak enforcement, weak regulatory regimes, and they have to act in a way which requires independent capabilities, but ideally collective capabilities. So to answer the question you posed, it was all about leadership. I mean, Siemens brought in a new team which knew how to do business in difficult circumstances and had the courage and experience to say to 400,000 employees, this is how we're going to do business. And to the previous speaker's question about, or observation about the difficulty, we gave support. I mean, if you couldn't make the sale because somebody was soliciting a bribe, walk out of the room. That's your guidance. So to answer your question, it's all about leadership. But the next step to enable leadership to do things effectively is the kind of collective action that Colette and Aaron have described. And last thing I'll say is we have very public examples of this in the United States, which I've given Colette some information about the diagnostic imaging business. The doctors are pretty corrupt in this world. And the vendors needed to act collectively to deal with the doctors. So end of speech. I hope I answered your question.
That's helpful. I mean, providing that perspective, Kulagani, I want to ask you, you know, we see discussions in South Africa framed around broad concepts like corporate governance, integrity. Do you detect an unwillingness amongst our business leaders to speak specifically about anti-corruption within their businesses? There is definitely an interest in supporting government initiatives to strengthen prosecutions, enforcement. We see investment in those issues, but why aren't South African business leaders speaking about corruption within their own ranks?
Thank you. I mean, again, you know, the previous speaker has spoken about the role of leadership. Leadership is absolutely important in anything, everything, in particular in fighting corruption within their own companies, but also externally. And so I will say that without the knowledge, I think I don't want to accept the presumption that business leaders do not talk about corruption in their companies. But I will say that if we really want to know what is gone wrong in a company, it's because there is bad leadership in that company, and that is why there's corruption happening, or corruption is allowed to continue. I mean, as you've said, as the business sector, we concur fully with the findings of your study in the policy brief that integrity is good business, because we've seen and we know what happens to companies that act and do business in a corrupt way, what happens to them. So we know that doing the right thing is actually good business. It is for that reason that, as you said, we're supporting anti-corruption measures by government. We have a work stream with government called a joint initiative against crime and corruption, in South Africa, where within the limited scope of business in the entire justice and crime prevention system of government, we are providing support because we recognize that corruption is bad for the country. And we talk about corruption where we see it. And so I am not in a position to speak on behalf of every individual company and what leaders do in that company, because it differs. But I think as a collective business, under the formation of a body like BUSA or BLSA, as organized business, it is certainly our view that corruption is bad for business, corruption is bad for society, and that we need to do something in fighting corruption.
Okay, so I want to move on then to speak about what can be done within businesses. And Colette, you speak in the paper about good faith anti-corruption programs. Tell us what that means exactly.
Yes, there is a difference between paper compliance or tick box anti-corruption compliance and effective good faith anti-corruption compliance, which really works. And I think the difference is leadership. It's proven that the tone from the top is absolutely vital in developing the culture within the organization. And Khulekane was speaking about the incentive structure of the organization. That's another key element. It's possible to evaluate anti-corruption compliance programs on criteria such as how do you reward your staff? Are they rewarded for sales, or are they rewarded for integrity, or both? There are other ways to test whether an anti-corruption compliance program is genuine. One of these is, for example, to see whether the person in charge of anti-corruption compliance, who do they report to? Do they have a seat on the board, or do they have to report to the CEO? Do they have decision-making power?
Peter, maybe you can reflect a little bit on anti-corruption compliance programs or good faith programs.
I think one of the most important components of a successful anti-corruption culture is the aspect of pride. Someone mentioned the effect on employees. It was my experience that if you allowed employees to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem in any country, you got immediate support. There's an aspect of pride in doing the right thing, having the knowledge that your company will back you up when you walk out of the room. I don't know how many people in this room have been solicited for a bribe. I've been solicited many times, and it's a skill you're taught in some countries, and it leads to enormously powerful, positive culture. And I think that's something that sometimes gets lost in this discussion. And good leaders recognize that, and they talk about it. And a key part of doing this well as a leader's communication. I mean, the best leaders talk about this all the time. And it's not their primary interest. Their primary interest is sales, growth, stock performance. They don't like talking about corruption. But if they're reminded to by their compliance officers or their lawyers, and they use it positively, it can be very effective.
And so that day-to-day support of anti-corruption efforts, the communications that you speak of, I mean, what else should we be doing on a day-to-day basis to encourage clean business within the framework of these programs?
Well, I think you have put your finger on something in your report that's very tactical, very effective, and that will appeal to CEOs. When we put together our collective action in the diagnostic imaging industry, I remember the guy who was in charge of sales for the United States. Oh my God, if you can make this work, I'll be thrilled, because the payments that he was being pressured to make were expensive. They went right to his bottom line. This collective action, when done effectively, is enormously attractive to business leaders.
So let's talk about a little bit about collective action programs then. We saw an excellent example of Uncle Soju's program in Nigeria, and we keep seeing good results. So Pranesh, you've taken some very bold steps in the SIU. Firstly, on prevention, and I want you to speak to that first, and then to the sectoral forums, which are taking us towards a collective action approach. So maybe just sketch for us, out of your investigation mandate at the SIU, how this prevention mandate emerged. And then we can talk about the sectoral forums.
When we redesigned our operating model a few years ago and having benchmarked internationally, we realized that as a country, we're very good at being reactive, investigating after the fact, setting up expensive commissions of inquiry, but nothing was being done in the space of prevention, actually detecting problems, identifying issues before they actually arose, then putting in the necessary measures to prevent a recurrence in the future. Because from a practical experience, what we found was that there were certain state institutions that almost had become habitual repeat offenders, where we were obtaining proclamations to investigate the same institutions. And the question had to be asked, well, in as much as it's good to investigate, why do we keep going back to the same places and having to investigate the same, if not similar, allegations over a period of time? It then dawned on us that what was required was prevention measures or prevention initiatives to complement existing reactive measures such as investigations. And what we found was that by shifting the needle and by focusing on identifying things or areas of risk or red flags or anomalies, identifying them timeously, and then being able to put the necessary mitigation or prevention measures in place to stop them from occurring. That would save us, firstly, a lot of time. It would save us a lot of money in not having to then investigate or set up these costly commissions of inquiry, or not having to embark on timely and on lengthy and costly litigation. But more importantly, at the time and with the approval of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy on the horizon, which places a lot of emphasis on prevention and talks about the protection of vulnerable sectors, we realized that it was opportune for us then to inculcate prevention as part of our operating model, so that the SIU wouldn't just be there to go in and investigate after the fact, after something has gone wrong, but we could actually then step in at a much earlier stage to detect and then to prevent. That then also informed, to a large extent, the establishment of the different anti-corruption forums that we've established. And the backdrop of the establishment of the forums is the protection of vulnerable sectors that's informed by the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. But the idea was that we needed to move away from the silo mentality of the NPA working on its own, the DPCI working on its own, the SIU working on its own. The success of the different anti-corruption fora is this: you have multiple role players from the same sector coming together, and this is the public sector and the private sector. It includes civil society, it includes regulators as well. We all sit around the same table. We discuss matters that are pertinent to the relevant sector. For example, if there are allegations that are reported pertaining to a sector, the parties will discuss the allegations, will decide who amongst the role players or the members of the forum are best placed to deal with the allegation based on their mandate. The matter is then allocated to the responsible member of the forum. They will then do what is required, but they will then report back. And in reporting back, we are then able to track and to monitor what is actually going on. And in that way, you then find that, for want of a better word, you can actually slice and dice the allegations. And as an example, in the health sector, we had an allegation that was, it was involving a certain eye institute. And what had happened was that there were allegations that were reported that involved corruption, fraud, regulatory breaches, a whole tax breaches as well, a whole area of irregularities. And what we had then found was it was easy then, because we had members of SARS in the forum, we had people from the regulators, we had the NPA, the DPCI, the SIU. Each one was able to take different aspects of those allegations and to deal with them. And the success factor is that I'm happy to say that there were a number of very positive outcomes in terms of monies being recouped, SARS being able to now launch an investigation into allegations of tax evasion, the National Department of Health now looking at breaches from a statutory point of view, and the regulators also now having taken action against the party that was accused of having committed the impropriety. Having said that, what we find that in as much as the forums are very active and they are working well, we've got one in health, one in local government, infrastructure, water sector is about to be launched, and border management and immigration. They're working very well, but we need to see more of a concerted effort by business to come to the party, because business is a very, very important stakeholder in these anti-corruption fora, given their influence, their skills, their resources, and their capabilities. And what we find is that if they're able to share that kind of knowledge, share the resources, share data, importantly, as well, we can then work together and we can make a bigger impact through the different anti-corruption fora.
I'm wondering whether they sound like enormous undertakings of coordination, running a group, a mixed group of, organizing groups of people together, enormous project management functions and coordination. Does the SIU have the capability to do that? How do you hold those forums together and take them forward?
It is a mammoth undertaking, but it is certainly something that we've been able to manage up to this point. However, the idea is that we've identified about 15 or 16 different sectors that are vulnerable to corruption. And the idea is that we want to set up sectors for each of these different sectors. But we can't do that at the moment because our time goes on managing what we have already between the 5 or 6 that are already in place. The idea in the long term is that we should be able to hand over custodianship of these different fora to the responsible state institutions. And what I like about the policy brief and what is advocated in the policy brief is that if there is a joint initiative by the public and the private sector, then perhaps we could get to the point where we could hand over, to a coordinating body, perhaps led by civil society, and that would then free us up to be able to look at the other sectors that we've identified as being vulnerable.
Peter, I'm wondering if you could also reflect on this issue, is that these sound like enormous undertakings. In your experience of collective action projects, how are these run? Who funds them? How are they organized? Especially in contexts such as South Africa, where we're struggling to run our governments, we're struggling to run our NGOs, we're struggling to run our anti-corruption institutions. Do you have any reflections on that?
Many, because I've seen it work and I've seen it fail. The major problem is mistrust among, you want to get the competitors in a market segment to cooperate. They hate each other. They're fighting with each other, day and night, whether it's a tender or, more broad-based distribution. So you've got to create some kind of trust among competitors who ordinarily are trying to kill each other to work together on this problem. And that's, I think, where civil society comes in. And I make the analogy to safety standard setting. If you can agree on things like amperage and voltage and so forth, you can agree on this kind of thing, but it's probably got to be done in a different part of the company at a higher level. I think civil society can play a very important role in convening the people who otherwise don't like talking to one another and frequently aren't allowed to speak to one another for antitrust reasons to speak to one another. That's the key thing. Now, in some industries, which are very concentrated because they know each other, there's a kind of informal collective action that goes on. I've received phone calls from people from competitors saying you might want to know what's going on in, this Vietnamese harbor or something. And I'm grateful for those calls because they're not going to the FBI or to the enforcement authorities in Vietnam. So to answer your question, it happens informally, it happens formally. The great impediment is, as was just suggested, nobody has time to spend on this because it's preventive rather than reactive, and that's always sort of lower on the list of our attention. But incredibly, the return on investment is enormous for multinationals, so certainly worth pursuing.
Pranesh, I'm wondering, just from your experience of running these forums, is how far away are we from an Uncle Soji type Nigerian miracle, just in terms of how things are organized, the capability to run these shows in the sort of framework that he explained to us?
It's a long journey, but I'm happy to say that we are certainly making significant progress in that regard. There's good rapport between the public and private sector in the different anti-corruption fora, and one thing I can see was, yes, I agree. Initially, there was this skepticism from the private sector, and there was this element of mistrust. Why are we here? What does government intend using us for? But we've overcome that, and we're working very, very well. I should also mention that there's currently an initiative between the public and the private sector called the Joint Initiative on Crime and Corruption, where the public and the private sector are working together to align their efforts against corruption. And the results thus far, have been very, very encouraging. For example, the automation of the subpoena process, which is going to save a lot of time. So by leveraging of businesses' experience, their skills and their capacity, I certainly believe that we will definitely get to where Uncle Soji found himself eventually, and sooner rather than later.
That's good to hear. So Colette, your recommendations, Aaron, your recommendations are bold in the policy brief. You say we need to all collaborate on one big project. What's the first step towards that from where we stand?
I think we can get to where Uncle Soji is now. He will be the first to admit that it's taken him 10 years of perseverance, very hard work, and ethical, strong leadership. And I think the first step, as is recommended in our policy brief, is to convene a civil society and business working group to identify, using research, using systems mapping, a good leverage point for intervention. Where can we start? And then we start where we are with what we have. And what we have is a network of excellent people in government, in civil society, and in business, both here and internationally, to support us in designing a successful anti-corruption collective action project.
Great. So I want to take a few questions from the chat and from the floor. I want just people in the room to let me know if you have a question, but I want to take one from the chat. This is Paul Hoffman. He says, corruption is a crime. Countering it is the work of the Criminal Justice Administration, where there's no political will to hold the corrupt to account and to seize, freeze, or forfeit their ill-gotten gains. What possible incentive is there to take touchy-feely prevention strategies seriously? Peter, I'd like you to take that question. Is this touchy-feely stuff?
I think that's hysterical. There's nothing touchy-feely about it. It's dollars and cents and maybe criminal liability. And somebody even touched on it, debarment. The thing you worry about the most as a government vendor or a vendor to the government is debarment. Not just in South Africa, but in other countries that have follow-on debarment schemes. So the idea that this is touchy-feely is ludicrous. This is dollars and cents, bottom line stuff for business leaders who normally don't think about this stuff because they're busy doing other things, selling stuff, and for whom this is foreign territory. And I want to compliment Aaron and Colette in their description of how this is done. For a business guy, very clear, logical, data-driven, and it's spoken in a language that a business person understands. And I think that addresses the touchy-feely aspect. A lot of the stuff in other fora is in fact touchy-feely. You should be better people. You should be better leaders. You should have integrity. You should have a better culture. It goes right over my head. But when I am presented with something that will work and help me avoid being debarred and save me some money, now we're talking. Not touchy-feely at all.
Yeah, thanks for that. Kulagani, I want to just ask you to just reflect on the proposals and just to close this discussion on collective action programs is to what extent is this a realistic proposal that Colette and Aaron make here about us taking some bold steps towards an initiative such as the Nigerian miracle example that we observed?
What I do agree with and appreciate from the policy brief is that we certainly have to do something about crime and corruption in particular, because we just can't let it be the way it is. So I agree that we need to do something. But our experience in sort of collaborative initiatives, including the current partnership that we have with government. By the way, on this call or online, there is Dr. Graham Wright, who is the CEO of Business Against Crime, who leads our work on the joint initiative against crime and corruption from the business side. So he can certainly tell you a lot more. We do need to find mechanisms that work, but our experience is that there's got to be something clear and tangible that you are coming together to try and solve, with clear deliverables, with clear outcomes that you seek. Too many fora have open-ended mandates and it becomes a shouting match and so on, and it doesn't get anywhere. So we're fully behind the idea that as society, certainly from the business side, we want to be part of fighting corruption in this country. Let's find mechanisms that work more effectively. The policy brief is exactly that, very brief to give us in detail what form this would take such that it is effective. It's not another forum where we talk, but we achieve nothing in the end. We want to collaborate in a manner that delivers results and in a manner that is effective. And we're happy to explore those going forward, in addition to what we are already doing.
Thanks for that. I see a question here in the room and another. You have a microphone in front of you, those work. Won't you just tell us who you are and ask your question, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you. I'm Sasha Stevenson from Section 27, and I was prompted by the question of where do we start? We've got to find the place to start. And I have an idea on where I think we should start. Health, as Pranesh knows very well from the SIU work on this, remains an area of that's particularly prone to corruption. And one of the wicked, difficult issues in our country at the moment is the question of NHI. And it's wicked and difficult because of legitimate and enormous fears of corruption. And it's wicked and difficult because we have been shouting at each other. Everybody has been shouting at each other for 15 years about this. And so there is no trust between any of the parties. But in order to build that trust, we need to do something. We need to implement something that's actually going to improve people's lives on all sides of the health spectrum. And in order to implement something, whether it's a maternal health intervention or an ability to access meds at any clinic or at any private pharmacy, we need to be assured that the enormous amount of money that's going to go towards the NHI system is not going to disappear. And there's been a lot of talk about anti-corruption mechanisms with NHI, but zero detail. Really, when you ask about it, you're told the SIU will take care of it, which is, as we've seen, firstly terribly unfair, and secondly impossible. It's not sufficient for prevention. So I wonder if in starting this, we could start with this. In starting this collective action process, we could start with something that's complex but starting to roll out and could really bring together the very varied stakeholders that need to participate in NHI so that we can actually start seeing health reform that serves people instead of spending another 15 years shouting at each other.
Thanks very much for that, Sasha. Any comments on that from the panel on that start, a complicated place to start, Sasha? Pranesh, your thoughts on that?
I agree wholeheartedly. Health is actually screaming for an intervention followed by education. But yes, and especially recently it goes back to 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic, the procurement of personal protective equipment. Now we're seeing it at Tembisa Hospital. And there's no reason to believe that what's happening at Tembisa is not happening in other hospitals in Gauteng or indeed across the country. So I would definitely endorse that. The health would definitely be a good place to start.
Good place. Thanks. I saw a question here. Won't you tell us who you are? There's a microphone in front of you.
Hi, my name is Luthfia Kala, and I'm also calling myself an anti-corruption compliance lawyer. Thank you for the policy brief. It's excellent, and I love the clear pathways to solutions in it, and very well researched and well written. And thank you to the SIU for all of the good work you're doing. And my question is to you. So I start with the sweet. And so I wanted to ask Pranesh, there's a draft national corruption prevention risk framework out for comment at the moment, closing 6th November. I'm interested in the name that you chose as not anti-corruption, but corruption. And secondly, what do you plan to do with the framework? Are you going to plan to use it as a best practice kind of schedule that you're going to hand over to vulnerable sectors? Or and who's the custodian of that? SOE is how it's going to work. Thank you.
Yeah. So in terms of the name hasn't been settled on yet. We are toying with the National Corruption Prevention and Risk Management Framework or the National Risk Management and Anti-Corruption Prevention Framework. But we needed a name to get it out there. But the name hasn't been settled. In terms of our intention, the SIU has taken it upon itself to develop this framework in support of the implementation of the National Anti-Corruption Strategy. And as you've correctly pointed out, the idea is that once the framework has been approved by Cabinet, it's going to be rolled out across the public and the private sector, and it will serve as a uniform, standardized set of criteria or guidelines that will be used for corruption prevention and risk management. Having said that, we don't want to impose this document because we do understand that work has been done already and that there may be existing frameworks in place. But what we are saying is that just to ensure that there's consistency and uniformity in approach, that all efforts should align to what the framework is proposing. In terms of custodianship, that as well hasn't been decided upon. Our job right now is to make sure that we can finalize the draft with the inputs after the public consultation processes and then have it ready to submit to Cabinet for approval. But the SIU is certainly putting its hands up to say, we would like to champion the implementation of the framework if given that opportunity.
Thanks. And there's still time to comment on
Yes, there is.
Yes, until the 6th of November. 6th of November. Okay. Any last questions in the room? So, in closing then, looking forward, maybe we'll just focus on leadership then. And we're all talking about leadership and asking people to lead. We're trying to lead on this panel. So if we could send one message to CEOs, accounting officers watching this panel, what would it be from the floor? Before I go online to hear some final comments. Pranesh, you understand?
Yeah, thanks very much.
Uh,
We spoke earlier about setting the tone at the top, and
yeah.
it's not just about saying the right things. It's about living those values.
Mm.
So my message to CEOs would be: don't just talk the talk, walk the walk, walk the talk.
Mm.
Share your resources, share your skills, share your capabilities with government.
Mm.
Let us join forces, and together we will be able to win the war against corruption. You can't underestimate the power of collective action, because it was collective action that brought us to the 27th of April, 1994. And in the same vein, if we work together as business and government, we can certainly win the war against corruption if we combine our forces. Together we can, and together we should, and together we will build a South Africa that the corrupt fear and that the honest will revere.
Thank you for that. Colette?
Yes, I would like to just say anti-corruption prevention pays. It will save you money, and it will save you stress, and it will decrease national risk.
Erin, any thoughts as we close?
I think just listening to also all the comments, and there's something as well about leadership. It's hold each other accountable. We talk about tone from the top, but almost want to say tone across as well. Sometimes it takes a lot of courage to call out your colleagues at the same level in other businesses in your sector, I think, but that courage needs to be built, and leaders need to hold each other accountable as well. To be able to build that integrity across the sector and not just within their core businesses themselves.
Thanks. Khulekani, your last comments to your colleagues who lead businesses, thoughts, advice, challenge to them?
Well, I think, as I've said, we support fight against corruption, and I would call on business leaders to intensify support, walk the talk, everything that's been said. I do think, though, as South Africans, we shouldn't let government off the hook lightly here. This is an entity that we give enormous amounts of taxes, that we give power to do certain things. We have got to hold our government accountable. Part of this fight will be won by all of us playing our part. So yes, business must come to the party, but I don't want us in these platforms to start giving up on our government or letting them off the hook lightly. We've got to demand more from our government. Thanks.
So we need leadership, government as well. And the last word to you, Peter. Advice for us, encouragement.
Well, first of all, encouragement. I think you're doing something really useful and fruitful in this project. I'm very impressed. Now I'm going to change tone slightly in saying I think exhorting leaders to be better leaders will not be fruitful. But what I think Colette identified is exactly the right path to take. Here we have something that's granular, that's functional, that's proven, and it focuses on prevention, which I think is a really important component of this. So I think you're on the right path. I think it's likely to be successful if pursued, and it's something that business needs. So good on you.
Thanks very much for that last word, Peter. And I want to thank everybody for coming and hand over to Erin for some last comments. Yeah.
Thanks, Cheryl. Just also thanks to everybody, for the team from ISS. Thank you for the work and the collaboration. The team from Anti-Corruption Coalition and GIBS as well. Being able to actually work on this policy brief together has been an amazing experience, and I think a very fruitful one. And then also just to thank Cut to Black for the production today, and also the GIBS technical team. Thank you for being here today and helping us out with all the microphones and so on. And then also the funding partners. Oh, my microphone is falling off. That's not the technical team's fault, that's mine. But also to other funding partners, the United Kingdom International Development, for funding the policy brief. And for everybody, there are refreshments just out the door to the right, after sitting for for the hour and a half, we can all have some nice refreshments and some networking and chatting about the brief. But thank you very much.
Yes, and thanks again to our panelists, everyone.